Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to our continuing webinar series. Thank you again to our friends at Site for making these possible so that no one has to pay. And thank you to today's webinar sponsor, our good friends over at Osprey Scientific. A couple housekeeping presentations and recordings will be available after at isa.org/webinars. Bottom of the page, they're usually up by the end of the day. Both the recording and a copy of the presentation as a PDF will be there. Reminder that Envirotech is virtual this year, June 11th and 12th, 27 presentations over 2 days, 7 webinars, about 13 to 14 hours of possible professional development for you. We've kept the prices intentionally low at $49 for members and $79 for non-members. So spread the word, sign up, help out ISA, help out your industry association. We'd very much appreciate it. Today's presentation is by Janice Kozlowski with SNC-Lavalin. What's in a guideline? A look back at the history of risk-based guidelines in Canada. So I'm just gonna, as always, switch over control to Janice and we'll get started, and there'll be questions and answers after Janice's presentation. Over to you, Janice.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks for having me. I'm just gonna make sure my screens are working right. Oops.
Looks good.
Okay, are we good here? I'll stop my video then. And again, thank you for hosting this. It's been a great opportunity to be able to, represent this. I know we did a really fun track, a full day session at REMTech last fall, and Shell organized the track for the day, and I had the privilege of being able to host one of the first presentations where I was just asked to kind of give a perspective of risk-based guidelines in Canada. And it was an opportunity. This isn't a risk assessment lesson. It's not how to do risk assessment. It was purely my perspective, recollection of things that came by. And we kind of ended up with some fun sessions at the end where we kind of tried to bust some of the myths associated with risk assessment and a little bit of a conversation on how things kind of evolved over the course of risk assessment in Canada. So let's see if I can get going here. A little bit about SNC-Lavalin. So I have the privilege of running the SNC-Lavalin's risk assessment team, and there's about 16 of us that are located across Canada. I'm in Saskatoon, and so our job is to support the contaminated sites team within SNC and serve them in risk assessment practices, both federally and in our local regions. So I'll just go through a little bit of history about risk assessment and how kind of guidelines came about in Canada. And then I'm gonna kind of take a little bit of time to talk about how we quantify risk and some of the things that go into these guidelines, and specifically talking about the tiers and the list of pathways and receptors and endpoints. And then if we have a little bit of time, because we have a little bit more time than a typical conference, we'll probably go through some of those myth-busting scenarios that maybe a few of you saw at REMTech. So before there were risk-based guidelines, as I recall, I always refer back to consulting to Health Canada in the early days of picking the priority contaminants. But prior to that, it was always my understanding, or what I was taught, was that we kind of had this concept of environmental law, and it was based on de minimis. So basically as low as the labs could detect in contaminants of concern. So the primary ones that came out in the world of environmental law were ones associated with benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, xylene, some of the petroleum hydrocarbons. This kind of evolved just after the US EPA was formed, and the contaminated sites in the states like Love Canal and some of the big impacted sites that were impacting human health. So risk-based guidelines as far as I ever understood, were based in human health concerns. Then we kind of moved to the idea of cleaning up our contaminated sites to background or to what was surrounding. Anyway, those were kind of the early concepts. And then Health Canada made a move to go to these human health risk-based guidelines. And that was kind of in early to mid 90s we started. I actually had the opportunity to help do training courses for Health Canada kind of by mid 90s, between 90 and 94. So guidelines started popping up. Some of the first ones were Alberta's MUST guidelines, and CCME was kind of a grouping of all the Canadian protection goals. This BC CSR, as we know it, the Contaminated Sites Regulations, kind of evolved in about 1995 to present day. And then we get pop-ups of federal interim groundwater guidelines, surface water quality guidelines. Health Canada still owns the reference values that are used to derive those guidelines. So anyway, we have a number of jurisdictions that are following along in these same principles. And as REMTech is held in Alberta, and this was Alberta focused, Alberta was kind of where I was living at the time and consulting, and that's where we started to develop these risk-based guidelines. And I had the opportunity to do my master's with Alberta Environment, supporting me with some contaminated sites and the data for that. So that's kind of where I got into it. I'm coming from an engineering background, so not so much the toxicology, but just a bit of the concept of risk assessment. So we're using kind of this as a tool in corrective actions for either spills or impacted sites. And it's used also to assess risk, but it also can be basically back calculated out to develop guidelines. So that's a little bit of the focus today. So risk assessment basically relies on a number of different tools, and depending on the pathway that you're assessing, that's how we kind of find a quantitative equation to describe what's going to happen with that exposure route. So I'll kind of go on to, the basic principles that we see every risk assessor talk about. So in order to have a risk, we have to have some kind of source of a hazard. So whether it's arsenic in our coffee or, benzene in a soil matrix in the ground beneath our house, for example. So then with that, we have to have some form of receptor or exposure. And finally, there has to be some kind of connection between the two. So I always use the analogy, if there's arsenic in my coffee and I don't drink coffee, then I don't have any risk. So basically, risk has some kind of potential for harm to the individual or the receptor that's exposed to it. And all those things combined is what will create a risk that we can assess. So one of the important things to note here is that a hazard is really something that can cause harm, electricity, falling off ladders, but the risk is the chance that someone will be harmed by that hazard. So here's another little pictorial way that we so we have this means of assessing risk, and everybody can relate to it in today's terms. We have a real heightened awareness of public health. Now everybody understands it. And so with that, as you kind of lower your risk, you have an increased cost and your benefit goes up to protection of the public. So we're trying to find this sweet spot, this balance between basically the reduction of risk and the benefit to the general population. So everything we choose to do every day, when we walk out our door, when we walk into our kitchen and turn on the kettle, there's some kind of risk in everything we do. And some of those highest risks are right in our house. You don't have to be outside. So it's a matter of determining what are we going to decide is acceptable. So now to start talking in terms of risk assessment for contaminated sites, we talk in terms of an incremental risk. So basically the incidental chance of having cancer over a lifetime. And then for non-carcinogens, which we call threshold compounds, those would be the chemicals that we would be exposed to that our body can handle. So we usually talk about those in terms of a tolerable daily intake. So I'm going to go through just the basic calculation. This is all there is to risk assessment. It's not rocket science. So, I usually come with my little bottle of a zinc supplement, and you can buy it in different doses. And if you read the back of it, it'll tell you your recommended daily allowance, which is kind of like a TDI, or toxicological reference value. Anyway, you take your zinc supplement, and it says it's 50 milligrams you're going to take per day. You divide that by your body weight, and all of these things are averaged or worst case out when we do these calculations in Guideline. So we get this 0.77 milligrams per kilogram body weight per day. So that's the calculated risk. So, and then you kind of go to Health Canada's TRVs, which are toxicological reference values, and they'll list them. And for zinc, it's 0.57 milligrams per kilogram body weight per day for adults. So right there, when I took my zinc supplement this morning, which is supposed to help your immune system, you're exceeding the allowable risk according to Health Canada. So this concept is a hazard quotient, and we'll talk about that in terms of contaminated sites. So it's simply taking the dose over the allowable limit, and this number is above 1, therefore in general terms that's what's considered acceptable. So anyway, so risks by choice or not. So that's the thing, we all accept a lot of risks in everything we do. So with contaminated sites, the premise was that we would set a limit that was allowable for people who weren't choosing to get sick, from a impacted site. So these limits are set by, federal regulators, and then provincial regulators will make their own acceptable levels. So in general, for Health Canada, they say that an acceptable incremental risk of getting cancer is either 1 in a million to 10 in a million. So basically between 10 to the minus 5 to 10 to the minus 6. And then we talked about non-carcinogens, so that hazard quotient. They will accept 0.2, so 1 out of the 5 media, up to 1. So different regulators then provincially. So Ontario, for example, its target level is 1 in a million. Saskatchewan's 10 in a million. Manitoba has a little bit of both. Alberta's is generally 10 in a million, so 1 times 10 to the minus 5. And then similar for hazard quotients, Health Canada recommends that we look at an acceptable hazard quotient of 0.2 if the contaminant is in all media, so soil, groundwater, air, consumer products, and food are the 5 media that they will consider. So there's basically kind of wanted to always take a few moments to kind of get this in perspective. So I generally talk about, the risk of getting cancer because that's something that everybody can kind of relate to. So just to put it in proportion, cancer is our leading cause of death in Canada. This is based on 2019 summary report at something like just under 30%, and heart disease would be a little bit lower. So some interesting things about your probability of developing cancer. The focus here, I just wanted to point out that this is kind of giving you a reference point for this 1 times 10 to the minus 5. So if we take our chances of getting cancer, above a certain age, and it varies whether you're male or female, but you basically get a number like this, so 0.43478 would be the chance of getting cancer. And then we're trying to lower that number by 0.1, or our contaminated sites, if we accept a level of 1 times 10 to the minus 5. This is kind of just to put it in perspective that we're dealing in many decimal points. So kind of moving on, there's lots of interesting things about our chances of getting cancer, and it has mostly to do with age. So as we get older, we have a higher incident of getting cancer, and then it drops off. So it has lots to do with the age of the population. And I always just throw up this slide just because I actually thought it was really interesting. As we move across Canada to the east, our chances of actually getting cancer increase. Quebec opted out of the study, so that's the legend there. But it's interesting because with that notable increase in incidence, we also note that Ontario then actually goes for a lower incremental chance of getting cancer from a contaminated site. And I'm not certain that that's the reason for it, but it kind of makes sense when we look at our overall regional or geographical location and what our provincial regulators would allow as acceptable. So kind of the key findings out of this is basically the number of cancer deaths and the incidence of cancer continues to rise, but it has more link to our growing and aging population than it is to the fact that we are actually, making huge progress in the battle against cancer. So it kind of doesn't show up in the statistics. But all the incidence of cancers combined peaked in 1988 and have been decreasing ever since. So anyway, I actually I vowed I wasn't going to talk about COVID, but when I was kind of putting the slides together, I thought it would make an interesting analogy, because this is something that we're all understanding right now and we're kind of bombarded with it every day. But currently, as of Monday, the chance of having COVID in our population was 5 times 10 to the minus 4. So it kind of gets that in perspective with what we're talking about for contaminated sites. And similarly, Alberta was a little bit higher, as we know, a few more incidents there and a larger population. So risk assessment is a methodology. And this is kind of generally how you see it. It's kind of, people will talk about these 4 main steps that you go through. So you form your problem, and you often will form your problem against some kind of regional applicable guideline in your area for your type of industry. So if it's petroleum impacted sites, we would kind of screen out the problem to see, hey, what's exceeding a guideline. Then we would move through this exposure assessment. So that's looking at the pathways. Am I eating the dirt? Am I breathing the air? And then on the same parallel note, we have a toxicity assessment. And often our toxicity is sort of handed to us by databases and, federal and medical officers. And sometimes we look at the data and we'll compile the data if, for example, Health Canada doesn't have a published accepted data set, then sometimes we will look at data sets and look a little bit further and go to the US or the World Health Organization. As we showed in our little calculation, we calculate some number through accepted equations based on how the contaminant transports through media, and we come up with some kind of outcome. Risk assessment is always intended to be an iterative approach. So we apply some best available science. Sometimes our certain input values are overly conservative, and we kind of iterate that until we can kind of come up with some confidence in our outcome. And we either take action, we remediate the site, we fence the site, or we collect more site-specific data to close the gaps. And then we ultimately are able to close the site and move off of an impacted site list. So back to this risk characterization step, as I showed you with the zinc example, it's just a fairly simple concept of math, and then it kind of moves on from there. So a little bit more about that risk characterization step. Health Canada generally says start with 0.2 in any media. So if you're looking at soil or groundwater, since then CCME will say certain contaminants aren't in our food, so they'll up the allowable hazard quotient to say 0.5 for benzene or for toluene. And then if the estimated daily intake is available and taken into account, we have a system of handling the estimated exposure from that. And if we know that information, then we can move to a hazard quotient acceptable of 1 if we aren't being exposed to it in any other means. And that generally is the direction that BC follows. So basically we have some variability in that endpoint, or the goalpost as I call it, by jurisdiction. So risk assessment, when do we use it? Well, as I started off, I mean, it's often used to develop guidelines, but it's often comes in handy when it's not possible to remediate a site or to manage the risks through some kind of physical aspect associated with the site. It can either be really remote or really densely in a dense urban area. Anyway, it allows you a mechanism to analyze the exposure pathways, see which ones are really causing your problems. So the pros of risk assessment is it often leads to a really sustainable approach to remediation. We find that guidelines are really conservative. They're just meant as an indicator to go ahead and do more things. Typically, it results in a lot of cost savings, and it's an acceptable method, and it's a way to kind of make the bar the same across Canada. So where else does it work? Well, it works for any contaminated site, which we've been primarily focusing on. It works for environmental impact assessments for proposed projects. We help guide the collection of data, guide assessing and site selection, and it works for spill response. It's a means to understand short and long-term impacts, and we basically have used it to develop new risk assessment guidance for environmental monitoring and impact assessments for DFO, and that was a project that was done last year. So how do we use it? Well, I've showed you sort of the mechanics of the tool and the math associated with it, but one of the key things that has come out of risk assessment as a methodology is this concept of weight of evidence and lines of evidence. So generally, we're trying to gather all the available evidence that we can get with respect to an individual site, looking at the geographical and regulatory framework that we're in, to try and protect the individual needs of the provinces and the territories. And then we're just kind of assembling those lines of evidence. So there's always, in this integration of lines of evidence, there's always sort of a risk opinion or a way of describing how we're going to interpret the results. So it ends up at the end, it's a really well-defined objective tool, but then there's this understanding and interpretation of it that allows us to make good decisions with respect to our environment. So anyway, that's a little bit about kind of where what we call it. We'll talk a little bit more about this tier 3 approach can get you, and I'll try and get my screen going. So what's in a guideline? Well, typically the guidelines were set up for 3 tiers. So tier 1 being just the lowest number in all the pathways that are being looked at, and make sure we understand that all the pathways aren't listed for everything. And that's kind of where construction workers and some of the unique short-term settings might come in. There's also the differences between tier 1, tier 2 would be more pathway specific, and then we might eliminate pathways for a given site that doesn't have any chance of vapor inhalation, for example. So a complete outdoor site like the mine site that I have in the corner there. And basically the point I wanted to make here is our protection goals between the different tiers don't change. We're always still dealing with the same target, same goalposts are still up, and it's just a more site-specific defined way of stepping through the process. So in the Alberta framework, we have tier 1, which I described as the generic remediation guidelines. Tier 2 would be site-specific information. We can recalculate those guidelines, or we can eliminate pathways, basically using the tier 1 numbers and the tier 1 input parameters. And then tier 3 would be normally what we would call like full-on risk assessment. We go out and we sample berries and we kind of actually get the specific data. We reduce a lot of uncertainty, and then we use the same equations, the same principles to come up with either predictions of risk or back calculating out what we would call a site-specific target level. So very simply, the requirements of tier 1 have land use sensitivity factors that feed in proximity of the site to surface water, for example. Similarly, the other grouping is the physical conditions. And this is where often different provincial regulations might vary just a little bit from, say, CCMEs. So for Canada, CCME is trying to make sure we protect all ecosystems in Canada, and in Alberta we'd want to take our specific soil stratigraphy, geology specific to, say, Alberta, and kind of fine tune it that way. And that's why you'll see slight differences between those different regulators, but the underlying premise is that we're all trying to protect to the same acceptable limit across Canada. And and given our demographics and our population, and sometimes our industries drive it, because there might be more need for specific guidelines related to oil and gas in Alberta than perhaps in another province. A little bit, just really general high level where things started to differ a little bit. So Alberta would have 5 land uses, whereas CCME has 4. This natural areas land use is really handy when we're assessing, mine sites in Saskatchewan, for example, because it allows for a less of a agricultural scenario and a more of a migratory ecological scenario. So basically the tier principles is based on these exposure pathways. And I'm just going to move through these quickly because I know that they're everywhere, but basically our groundwater quality guidelines are covering potable groundwater, vapor inhalation sources, dermal contact, and incidental ingestion. Protection of the DUA stays in both categories. So the soil qualities are developed, to protect the domestic use aquifer. So that would be sort of one line of evidence, and then we could go ahead and measure the contaminant concentration in the groundwater to see what's actually getting there. So this is a good example where your groundwater quality data would be more heavily weighted than the soil quality data. So that's kind of the concept between two ways of approaching a assessment of a site. So human health, I'm going to get into a few equations just really quickly, just to show you that they're not always that intuitive or straightforward. But basically for soil ingestion, Health Canada recommends that we look at the top 1.5 meters, dermal contact the same. I believe BC's depth of exposure for those pathways is possibly 1 meter. Vapor inhalation originally was kind of, they looked at about 30 meters away, but we know now the science indicates that vapors actually don't migrate that far from the source. And similarly, the protection of the potable groundwater, we generally want to protect our drinking water supply, so we often don't look at a distance in that pathway. I'm going to focus primarily on human health equations, but just to have it in perspective, this was the basis of some of the ecological exposure pathways that were considered. So we have protection of livestock watering, agricultural land uses, and irrigation comes up, and surface water and ecosystems in surface water bodies. And then the only thing I wanted to focus on here is just some of the rules around ecological exposure pathways. So protection of groundwater for aquatic life. This 500 meters is a CCME distance for petroleum hydrocarbons and inorganics, so and metals. And then Alberta bases their guidelines on the science or the literature that indicates that petroleum hydrocarbon plumes generally will only migrate about 300 meters down gradient of a source and 100 meters up gradient. So we get into some really subtle differences when we kind of get into the weeds of what regulatory body we're working with. I actually wanted to go back and did want to mention in some of the earlier publications from CCME, when they decided that the ecological contact for petroleum hydrocarbons likely didn't go beyond 1.5 meters, and often we consider surface soils up to 3 meters. There's a gap there between 1.5 meters, which is where the human health contact ends, and the eco contact for petroleum hydrocarbons, and then to 3 meters. So technically there could be a depth of soil beneath your site that actually didn't have a guideline. And that's my understanding of why management limits came into place. So they were basically just put in for the petroleum hydrocarbon fractions, and they were just intended to fill a gap so that you couldn't end up with a space that had absolutely no guideline and you could leave whatever you wanted there. So these are kind of the list of the receptors of concern. We are always talking about age groups. When we talk about cancer risk, we're generally just applying it to full lifespan. So we look at the adult drives that. And then often, because toddlers are everywhere and touch everything and eat dirt, they tend to be, their bodies are the littlest and they're consuming the most. So they tend to be the often the critical receptor for non-carcinogens or threshold compounds. And a little bit, again, just how pathways in various provinces vary. for how they're applying. So it gets kind of confusing really fast. And similarly for groundwater, I indicated before, we have these natural lands land use category in Alberta, and that's been picked up in the federal interim guidelines. So basically nobody intended to have their guidelines different from each other, and often it's just a factor of who kind of has a contract or budget to put out another publication. So they kind of tag team a little bit. And it's important to note that the intent of all these regulations is generally with the same goal in mind. So I want to move into a little bit about kind of a conceptual site model drawing. And, you know, we talked about these equations. I showed you one. So in a conceptual site model, this is kind of what we want to end up with, a kind of an understanding of where our contaminants are moving and who might get exposed to them. But the point of this is you can see that it gets really messy really quickly. So if you look at each arrow as an equation, we're kind of just compiling a bunch of equations, you know, in a spreadsheet so that you can kind of get your head around which pathways are driving your remedial actions. So that's kind of, you know, the easiest way to sum it up in a picture. So here's one of the equations. So this is a threshold substance. So we'll just take, you know, how do we get, I use the term SEQS, which is the Saskatchewan term for a quality standard. And so we have different components. So when we talked about human health, we have that soil ingestion equation there. We have the exposure from inhalation of particulate matter. We have the dermal contact. We have some kind of exposure terms. So how many days a week are you at the site? How many hours a day are you there? Then on the top, we add in the background concentration for that contaminant of concern. And then we kind of are able to put this all into a relative equation to this tolerable daily limit minus our actual daily limit of whatever it is we're consuming. This source allocation factor, soil allocation factor, would be what Health Canada is dictating as acceptable. So Alberta lists them as well. So that would be the 0.2. And then here's our body weight, and it's just general average population. So no consideration of male, female, but that's where the different age groups come in. So basically we do that for all the different equations, and we come up with these really, you know, linear equations, but they don't become intuitive or trivial with time. So that's kind of the concept of how these guidelines are developed. So we have these dilution factors that come into play. You know, they'll be fed by another equation, which is an attenuation of soil vapor through the through distance, is how the Canadian ones are based, with a few exceptions. And yeah, and then we move into these really complicated. Vapor inhalation is one of the more complicated equations and less intuitive to really be able to determine what in your equation is driving your risk. So that's kind of a, you know, a really quick overview of one of these. This is just one pathway equation. So basically, message is not exactly straightforward to somebody who's not doing this all the time. So basically, soil vapor screening levels, the thing I wanted to illustrate here is this is kind of a nice way of graphically kind of showing what's going to really matter in your equation. And so you can kind of see your bioattenuation factor is a really significant input parameter that really affects your output or your soil vapor screening level. Much less so is things like, you know, the building factors and the vapor-filled soil porosity, which doesn't vary a whole lot. So that's kind of a way that it's easy to look at some of these equations and kind of play with them to see what kind of data is most valuable to collect at your site. So similarly, I will just quickly go through freshwater aquatic life calculations. So we have a lot of dilution factors when we're dealing with soil to groundwater transport, and they're no longer linear, no longer straightforward, and not intuitive. But these are the equations that go into these worst case conditions that are your guideline or your tier 2 guideline. And those are the things that we are able to bring in site-specific information to adjust to come up with a equally protective approach to our contaminated site. So just a little bit more on some of the dilution factor equations and what plays into them. So going into that same concept, this is an interesting one because it indicates the sensitivity of the hydraulic conductivity on a site. Again, along the bottom is the benzene site-specific target level. And you can see how it varies between the soil guideline and the groundwater guideline. And this dashed line is where you wouldn't need a guideline anymore. Similarly, hydraulic gradient kind of is tracking pretty much the same. And again, you'll have a limit where you no longer would have a chance of even having a risk. So it's kind of interesting to see. The most obvious one is the distance to surface water. So as you would expect, as your distance goes up, distance away from the site, you get to a much higher benzene site-specific target level. And that's probably the most intuitive one to look at. So guideline modifications, just going again, just taking a few parameters at a time. We're looking at the width and the length of the contaminant plume. So we can kind of see here that the length doesn't matter and it's all about the width. And similarly, contaminant depth. So anyway, you kind of get the concept. So that was kind of the, the gist of what I wanted to go through into kind of how these guidelines are evolve and how they're developed. And those equations haven't had a lot of change over the years, so it's been fairly easy to stay consistent with how we assess them. So we'll just go through a little bit of trivia, and I know people can't unmute, it becomes too problematic to answer. So first one is fact or fiction, tier 1 versus tier 2 versus tier 3. Is tier 3 more protective or less protective than tier 1? Give you a chance to think about it. And the answer is it's the same. So it was always intended to have the same level of acceptable limits. Similarly, vapor inhalation pathway, maximum science-based distance to petroleum hydrocarbons for vapor intrusion. So I talked about it a little while back, the 30 meters was based on the original vapor transport model, which was based on volatile organic carbons. And then now that the research has kind of caught up with petroleum hydrocarbon impacted soils, we kind of have found that depending on if there's free phase product, where the vapor plumes tends to stay more in a reaction zone or a separation distance, and it's either like between 0 and 2 meters or 6 feet, or 10 feet away from the source if there would happen to be NAPL there. So that's a concept that's being considered across Canada, has been accepted. Atlantic Rebecca now reflects that in their conclusions. I know in Saskatchewan we often use the US EPA's science on proposing risk management strategies and plans. So that kind of was just what I was talking about there. So the original vapor transport model that we assessed, and it's often now what we deferred to the Johnson and Ettinger model for CCME. That was just based, 30 meters was the distance where none of the numbers changed anymore. That's really how it happened. And now we kind of use that 30 meters as a screening for an adjacent sensitive land use. But that's what the 30 meters was based on. And I just wanted to comment that Ontario's regs have reduced that down to lateral screening distance of 15 meters. So fact or fiction? I told you the answer to this, so you should know it. What's the distance that applies to a dissolved PHC plume in groundwater? And this is our science-based answer, 30 meters down gradient, 100 meters up gradient. And the question is it unique to all COPCs? And no, that was intended. This is based on petroleum hydrocarbon plumes. And yes, it is specific to the Alberta regs. I'll let you read this one, and I'm going to mute. So management limits, kind of talked about this one too. Originally, they were intended to fill a data gap. I think that the new CCME guidance that's out in draft, I believe, is has a management limit in that is half solubility. So sort of where's the fence on whether you go looking for more information. It would be a physical limit that would kind of cause NAPL to develop. And the other possibilities, was it a soil gas concentration? And the answer is right now it's D, none of the above. So management limits described, just basically a few things about depths and why. I talked about this earlier, but why that ecological pathway was removed. And then we wanted to have basically on the PHC fractions, supporting technical documentation, they just identified a data gap there, and that was kind of the original 2008 CCME document that that explained that. So management limits have sort of carried across as, as a thing that they generally don't cover the risk-based pathways. It's not developed with the equations that we demonstrated, but they were kind of meant to plug a data gap so that you didn't end up with no guideline. So I think we're getting close to the end here. What does a numeric exceedance of a tier 1 or tier 2 guideline mean? And the options are, do we have an adverse effect? Will somebody die soon? Nothing will happen. And D, take a closer look. And the answer is D. Just kind of a guide to help us focus our assessment and our decision-making process. So in summary, risk assessment was kind of intended to be a systematic I can't talk anymore, quantitative process to make a good decision. And it's actually a really powerful tool. It uses conservative assumptions. It's intended to iterate, identify data gaps, focus you on what really matters at your site so you can save a lot of money in risk management measures. And it was originally intended where we originally did it probabilistically, and it was intended to use kind of mean values, like what's the average body weight of a Canadian, what's the average, amount of water that we drink. And then, as with most guidelines, people try to lean towards the more conservative assumptions, so that they slowly inched up, in the first screening levels to use maximum concentrations. And as you've seen in a ton of these equations, it is often multiplied in the equation. So you start pulling in 95th percentiles or maximums, and pretty soon you have an output of your multiplicative equation that's 99.999% protection of anything bad ever happening. So it's important to understand that we just use these numbers and this quantitative approach as a sense check, like when do I have to do more, when do I have a problem? So the point of the guidelines is it's a screening mechanism, it's a check balance, it's a tool to indicate, hey, when do we have to look at this further? So the takeaway I wanted to send home was an exceedance of a guideline or any other reference value doesn't necessarily equate to an adverse effect, but just a tool to guide you into next steps. So with that, I again want to thank Joe for asking me to offer this presentation again. A number of people at SNC-Lavalin help all the time with assessing these equations, finding the data that fits in. So a few of our team there were helping out, and Shell, of course, had initiated this whole idea of doing this whole series for REMTech, and thanks to them, as always, for supporting our efforts in science related to contaminated sites. So with that, Joe, I'll kind of let you take control, and I can open it up for questions.
Great, thanks, Janice. That's a lot of information. It takes me back to my university days and my head hurts. It's great. So as always, if you have questions, please type them in the question box, and I will get to as many as I can. Just a reminder while you're typing, hopefully some questions, that The webinars are available. The archives of these, the recordings and the PDFs will be available later today at isa.org/webinars. And there's a few more coming up. There's one more tomorrow, and there's a number still coming up. And June 11th and 12th, my Envirotech plug again, reminder to check out the mini agenda and help ISA out and take in some great webinars. Is there any questions out there? Okay. Janice, people would like your email address for further clarification.
I'm pretty sure that you probably know better how to send that out. It's just janice.paslowski@snclavalin.com. If you could spell that.
Yeah, first name dot last name at snclavalin.com. Is it true that a contaminant exceeding the management limit in soil is considered to be a source material and must be excavated, not managed in place?
So I think that's how it's being administered in some regions, and that was kind of a little bit of the point of this. It wasn't intended to be used for that. There's different wording that comes with the definition of a management limit, but I like to refer back. So when we talked about those exposure pathways, they're all covered. All the exposure pathways are covered. And then the management limit is not risk-based. It was sort of more as a net in case you had no exposure. So I prefer to use it only as a screening tool if there's no applicable pathway. And that's kind of the catch-all for how you would not leave a big plume of liquid product or a tank in the ground just because you had no exposure. And as we all know, in those days, like way back, that was happening, right? We didn't have to always remediate our underground storage tanks, but the science and the remedial rules have evolved so far that I call it an artifact.
Okay. Interim chlorophenol guidelines, but some of the chlorophenols are not incorporated in the guidelines. Is there a reason why? Do you know?
That's probably over my head. I could probably answer that better in an email. Often when a guideline isn't included, my understanding is Health Canada hadn't identified it as a priority substance, or they haven't yet got enough information about the toxicological properties of that contaminant. And specific to that question, I wouldn't specifically know which one it is, but I definitely could find out.
Okay. In your Q&A, you said exceedance of tier 1 or 2 is not adverse effect. Did I hear that correct?
Yes. Yeah, it's those tiered numbers are super conservative. They use a worst case input for each of those values in whatever equation you're looking at. So it's a worst case scenario. So the easiest way to explain it, a FAL protective guideline might be based on salmon, and we don't have any in Saskatchewan. So you kind of have to dig into the guideline before you could predict an adverse effect at your site. So remember, in general, they're meant for Canadians' entire ecosystem. So it'll be really different input in Newfoundland compared to Manitoba.
For clarifications, for PHC plumes, how does a 100-meter upgrade and 300-meter downgradient help with the risk assessor calculate risk?
Well, beyond the limits of that plume, you can eliminate a pathway. So FAL is a good example, might not apply to your site if you don't have a receiving environment within 300 meters. Whereas if you were assessing a federal site, that would be within 500 meters, that limit. So you could conceivably have to assess FAL and in another jurisdiction, as opposed to under the Alberta regulations, it's somewhat smaller, and Alberta's regs are based on available science. So, I mean, you can as a risk assessor in tier 3, you are allowed. We go to other jurisdictions where we feel the science is closer to applicable to our site. And that's where I was talking about that weight of evidence argument. So we could do something like that. Now, I'm not sure it would be accepted, but generally like in Saskatchewan. So if we're looking at a receiving environment of freshwater aquatic life, we would just say, and by the way, it's a petroleum hydrocarbon impact, and Alberta references this research. So we would like to apply it here. And then the regulator has the option to accept it or get it peer reviewed, get a second opinion. And that's a lot of that happens within the world of risk assessment. We often, our work is peer reviewed by other risk assessors. Health Canada works that way as well, as does Environment Canada. Does that answer the question?
I guess so. I hope so.
That was long, sorry.
No, that's okay. How do you overcome the stringent DUA definitions in Alberta to finalize a risk assessment in urban settings where shallow groundwater is not used?
That's a really good question. And of all my COVID news washing, I should be opening with that. A really good hydrogeologist and a really good characterization of the stratigraphy at your site and confidence in the uniformity of the stratigraphy would be my risk assessor hat on. But we find that I have a great hydrogeology team that supports those decisions when we make the recommendation. So that's kind of how we approach it. But it has to have buy-in from, in that case, the municipality has to be willing to accept that, and then AEP has to be willing to accept that too. And I'm hoping that all regulators, I know in Saskatchewan, we've moved towards that when we're in a any kind of municipal setting, that there's good bylaws in place that you can't say you can't put in a water well in your backyard. That's one way around it.
Okay. Would bogs be considered a freshwater aquatic life receptor?
Yes, yeah, because it's not just fish. And I am not the ecological risk assessor. So again, I would just answer as yes. And if you want more descriptions on how we assess receiving water environments, we look a lot at whether they're seasonal or intermittent water bodies, and then you can have a biologist assess the habitat there. Then you can do, CCME has a tool for doing a density, a species specific distribution, and you can take out some of the receptors if say trout was in that derivation of a specific contaminant. You would be able to take that receiving environment, pull out certain species that are in the derivation, and then develop a site-specific objective for that water body.
Okay, I think we'll do a couple more questions. Can you use administrative controls to obtain risk-based closure?
Yes. And it depends kind of what province on how receptive. Usually I think, and again, this is my opinion, I think that the biggest challenge for the regulators is whether their regulations allow for tying administrative controls to the land title. And I would also there want to defer into an email question, and I'd get a BC risk assessor to help me out, because my understanding is the certificate of compliance go with the title, and then that system works really well. In Saskatchewan, that's what's intended, and it's not in place yet, so it does pose some challenges, but they've put in a mechanism of notice of site condition. Similarly, in Manitoba, they have a impacted sites registry, which makes all these mechanisms where the public can go in and check their site, makes it easier to follow these administrative controls. So the problems lie when you put administrative controls on and then the owner sells the site and the administrative controls don't carry over, is where the hurdle is, in my opinion.
Okay. For CCME guidelines, the 500 meters to eliminate the foul receptor for PHC, you mentioned it applies to metals as well. Is that correct?
That's what's written in the federal interim guidelines as PHCs and inorganics.
Okay.
I know like chlorides, so less biodegradable and more soluble. Chlorides, for example, there's a category for that, and that's 10 kilometers. So just read the fine print. Your federal interim groundwater guidelines describe it probably the best and have the best description of the equations that go in.
Okay. And we'll do one more. Is the HHRA the only connection between generic guidelines to address other receptors like bioaccumulation through food chains?
I'm not sure I understand the question. So a guideline doesn't account for bioaccumulation through the food chain. That pathway isn't assessed, and yes, we would normally assess that at a tier 3 level through a HHERA, like a full human health and ecological risk assessment.
Okay.
Would be my attempt at the answer. And anyway,
No, I think so. I think so. If people are interested, and if Janice is okay with it, if you email me directly, I can supply you Janice's contact email or information, and I'm sure I'd be happy to talk to you further, answer some questions, whatever. A reminder, this will be posted later again today. Thank you again, Janice. Thank you, SNC Lavalin. Thank you, Osprey Scientific, for sponsoring this webinar today. Very much appreciated. And thanks to our good friends over at Site for sponsoring the entire series and allowing ESA to keep these free for everyone. So that's it for today. Thank you again, everyone. Thank you, Janice, and stay safe. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Take care.
Take care.